All right, this is pretty cool. One of the things that I have been playing with is the Waypoint missions. So what I did is I created a mission and I loaded it to the flight controller's EEPROM, so the electronically erasable, programmable read-only memory. So that way it stays on the flight controller. When I unplug the battery and replug the battery in, the mission stays in there. So I'm going to go ahead and load it up. And if you notice, what it looks like is I have a waypoint, or I have a mission with 4 different waypoints. But in reality, if you zoom in, you'll see that what I did is I put all of these waypoints almost right next to each other, because I have yet to find a way to get inav to fly the mission over and over and over again. So each one of these, so it's going to fly this mission, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, and then when it's finished, it's going to come down here to the last waypoint and just circle overhead. I wanted to use the black box and check out what the flight path of the Strix Nano Goblin looked like. So that's what I did. And for me to play the BlackBox software, I did something really pretty cool. Is I downloaded Stronag, his MWP Tools. It only runs on Linux, so I followed this guy's I don't know, wiki, and I installed Linux on a virtual machine using VirtualBox. So if I go ahead and start this up, when I start this up, I have a Linux machine that's running virtually behind all of my other stuff. So I can launch my MWP Tools. And this is pretty cool because I still have my flight controller, or my flight controller plugged in. I have it checked exactly right here. So using this, I can connect to it. And then here happens to be my house. And if I go in here and I restore the mission from the EEPROM again, it's going to say, hey, wait a minute, my house is much farther than the first one is, but I'm just going to hit OK and uncheck this in view. And if I zoom out, I can go and see where all of those waypoints are. So I was able to make the waypoints using inav, but now you can see it looks fairly similar. I have already downloaded the BlackBox file from my flight controller to the Linux box. So I go to File and then Load BlackBox Log. I find it where I stuck it in my documents, and it gives a list of all of the time-stamped files that happen to be in that log. I click on the one that I want, and what it does is it previews it going pretty fast, and you can see the plane is doing a very good job. Up is north, and the wind is coming from the southeast, so you can see it push it up a little bit, but you can see that the Strix Nano Goblin is doing a fantastic job hitting all of the waypoints, and when it finishes, it goes to the last one, and it circles overhead. And then I'm going to take control over it, and then I'm going to land it right to where I was standing. I think it did a fantastic job. I did my best to sync all 3 cameras up. I used the artificial horizon indicator, but I don't know if it is because my DVR only records in 3 or 4 minute chunks. It loses a half a second or so when it picks the next video segment, or if it's different frame rates. But after every 3 or 4 minutes, it seemed like the artificial horizon indicator on both or all 3 videos would be off by about a second or so. So I did my best. I scooched some things over, and I still think it came out really well.
11 satellites. Heading 219, range 272, bearing 120, elevation 147, voltage 7.9, 13 satellites. 11 satellites, 1 minute. Heading 95, range 610, bearing 170, elevation 144, voltage 7.8, 14 satellites. 13 satellites. Heading 97, range 511, bearing 221, elevation 141, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 14 satellites. Heading 244, range 259, bearing 121, elevation 131, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 14 satellites. Heading 73, range 606, bearing 167, elevation 134, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites, 14 satellites. 2 minutes. Heading 170, range 452, bearing 217, elevation 154, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 249, range 334, bearing 109, elevation 131, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 125, range 518, bearing 177, elevation 124, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 270, range 403, bearing 202, elevation 127, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 3 minutes. 16 satellites. Heading 252, range 387, bearing 116, elevation 137, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 124, range 583, bearing 173, elevation 134, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 188, range 465, bearing 215, elevation 150, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 245, range 295, bearing 112, elevation 124, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites, 4 minutes. 16 satellites. Heading 118, range 554, bearing 171, elevation 134, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 271, range 400, bearing 203, elevation 141, voltage 7.8, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 284, range 406, bearing 119, elevation 131, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 119, range 541, bearing 174, elevation 131, voltage 7.7, 5 minutes, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 267, range 442, bearing 205, elevation 127, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 241, range 295, bearing 112, elevation 137, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 112, range 583, bearing 172, elevation 127, voltage 7.7, 15 satellites. Heading 100, range 515, bearing 218, elevation 127. Voltage 7.7, 16 satellites, 6 minutes, 15 satellites. Heading 240, range 262, bearing 120, elevation 131. Voltage 7.7, 16 satellites, 15 satellites. Heading 106, range 583, bearing 173, elevation 141. Voltage 7.7, 16 satellites, 18 satellites. Heading 246, range 419, bearing 214, elevation 141. Voltage 7.7, 17 satellites, 18 satellites. Pilot has control. Heading 257, range 45, bearing 263, elevation 124. Voltage 7.7, 17 satellites, 7 minutes, 18 satellites. Heading 221, range 108, bearing 270, elevation 134. Voltage 7.7, 17 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 247, range 91, bearing 265, elevation 141. Voltage 7.7, 17 satellites. Heading 263, range 59, bearing 218, elevation 134. Voltage 7.6, 18 satellites, 17 satellites. Heading 262, range 68, bearing 196, elevation 127. Voltage 7.5, 18 satellites, 8 minutes, 16 satellites. Heading 310, range 78, bearing 203, elevation 144. Voltage 7.5, 17 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 339, range 167, bearing 205, elevation 147. Voltage 7.6, 17 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 55, range 190, bearing 213, elevation 150. Voltage 7.6, 17 satellites. Heading 148, range 177, bearing 228, elevation 144. Voltage 7.7, 18 satellites, 9 minutes, 17 satellites. Heading 155, range 200, bearing 247, elevation 154. Voltage 7.6, 18 satellites. 17 satellites. Heading 248, range 380, bearing 159, elevation 111. Voltage 7.7, 18 satellites. Heading 352, range 213, bearing 194, elevation 68. Voltage 7.6, 17 satellites, 18 satellites. 10 minutes. Heading 58, range 127, bearing 220, elevation 49. Voltage 7.6, 17 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 132, range 19, bearing 202, elevation -9. Voltage 7.8,